Are you lost? Or do you just enjoy loitering where you don't belong?
Brooke's voice echoed sharply across the cold marble lobby, her face twisted into a sneer of pure condescension.
We don't hand out free charity accounts to every older black woman who wanders in off the street.
What the arrogant receptionist didn't know was that she was talking to Dr. Vivian Ellison, the brilliant, self-made billionaire, the chief executive of a $4 billion fund, and the exact client this bank was desperately waiting to sign that very day. Vivian didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her hands calmly folded over a worn manila folder. Her dignified, unshakable silence only infuriated Brooke more. With a sudden, aggressive sweep of her hand, Brooke sent a first-time savers brochure flying across the polished granite desk. The heavy, glossy paper skidded hard and fast and stopped just inches from Vivian's chest.
People like you always think you can just walk into these high-end spaces.
Brooke barked, leaning forward with hostile momentum.
There's a little community credit union across the street that's a much better fit for your kind. Now back away from my desk and stop blocking the good chairs for our actual clients before I have security throw you out.
Vivian simply looked at her, her expression unreadable. She wasn't going to raise her voice. She wasn't going to cause a scene. She was going to sit down, let them dig their own grave, and then take their entire $400 million institution apart. Piece by piece, by the end of that single afternoon, the regional director who smirked at her would be cleaning out his office. A federal investigation would be opening, and an entire bank's hidden machinery, the machinery it used to decide who deserved a loan and who didn't, would be dragged out into the light. All because of one woman, one old folder. And the question nobody in that marble lobby thought to ask, who is she? But to understand how a quiet woman in an unremarkable coat brought a powerful bank to its knees in a single afternoon, you have to go back 50 years, to a 9-year-old girl standing on a curb, watching everything her family owned get carried out the front door by men who would not look her in the eye. So yeah, that's where this really starts. Let's get into it. It's 1974, a row house on the south side of Cleveland. A cold morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and the radiators have been off for a week because the gas got shut off first. A 9-year-old girl named Vivian stands on the sidewalk in a coat that's too thin, holding her little brother's hand. He's 5. He doesn't understand what's happening. She does. She understands all of it. There are 2 men carrying their kitchen table down the front steps. Behind them, another man with a clipboard, a county marshal, reading numbers off a page in a flat voice, like he's reading a grocery list and not the end of a family's whole world. The girl's mother stands in the doorway with her hand pressed flat against the frame, holding herself up, because if she lets go of that door frame, she is going to fall down right there on the porch. And she has decided, somewhere deep down, that she will not fall down in front of her children. Not today. Here's what nobody on that street knew that morning. Vivian's father had a job, a good one, at the steel mill. Vivian's parents had never missed a payment they could make. But 2 years earlier, when the mill cut hours, they'd gone to the bank to ask about refinancing. The same thing the White family 3 doors down had done the year before, and gotten without a problem. And the bank had said yes. But the loan they were given wasn't the loan the White family got. It had a balloon clause buried on page 9. A rate that doubled in the 3rd year. Fees stacked on fees. The kind of paper a bank only writes for people it has already decided are not going to make it people it intends to take the house back from. Because the house on the south side is worth more empty and resold than it is with a black family living in it and paying it off slow. The girl's father didn't have a lawyer. He had a handshake and a signature and a belief, a beautiful, devastating belief, that the rules were the same for everybody. They were not. So, the table comes down the steps, and the marshal hands the mother a single sheet of paper, a foreclosure notice, and the mother takes it. Because what else can she do? And she folds it once, in half, and she slips it into the pocket of her apron, like it's a receipt. And little Vivian watches her do that. Watches her mother fold up the worst day of their lives into a neat little square and put it away. Because there were 2 children on that sidewalk who still needed breakfast. Somehow, somewhere. And a mother does not get to fall down. That folded piece of paper. Remember it. We're going to come back to it more than once. But before we leave that sidewalk, I want you to see the rest of that morning, because the details are the whole thing. After the table came the chairs. After the chairs, the bed, dragged sideways through the front door, scraping the paint, and one of the movers cursed under his breath because it caught on the frame, and Vivian's mother flinched at the curse, not at the loss of the bed, at the cursing in front of her children. Because she had spent 9 years teaching this girl that you carry yourself a certain way no matter what the world does to you. And here was a stranger cursing while he carried her bed out into the street. And there was nothing she could do about it. And that, the helplessness of it, was the part that nearly broke her. Vivian saw all of it. She was 9. But she was the kind of 9 that some children are forced into early. The kind that watches and remembers and understands more than the adults around her think she does. She watched a neighbor across the street, a woman her mother had brought soup to when that woman was sick the winter before, pull her curtains closed so she wouldn't have to see. She watched the men from the mill, her father's friends, drive past slow and then speed up, ashamed, unable to look, because in those days a foreclosure was treated like a contagious disease, like the family had done something to deserve it, like poverty was a moral failing and not a thing that was done to you by men with clipboards. She watched her father, who was the strongest man she knew, stand on the curb with his hat in his hands. His hat actually in his hands, holding it, the way men hold their hats at funerals. And she understood, for the first time in her life, that her father, who could fix anything, who could carry her on his shoulders all the way to church, could not fix this. Because this was not broken by accident. This was working exactly as designed. And here is the detail that Vivian carried longer even than the folded paper. When the truck was loaded and the men were gone and the family stood on the curb with everything they owned in the back of a borrowed pickup, her father put his hat back on, and he knelt down in front of her and her little brother, and he said, in a steady voice, "This is not the end of us. Do you hear me? Men decided this in a room. And one day, one of you is going to be in the room." He didn't know which of his children he was talking to. He was talking to both of them. The way a man talks when he's pouring everything he has left into the only thing he can still give, which is the idea that it doesn't have to stay this way. He died 11 years later, of the kind of slow grinding down that poverty does to a body, and he never saw what his daughter built. But the sentence stayed One day, one of you is going to be in the room. Vivian organized 50 years around that sentence. She got in the room, and then she spent her whole life making sure that when she was in the room would never do to anyone else what it had done to her father with his hat in his hands. Now, jump forward. 50 years. Same person. Different world. Dr. Vivian Ellison is 58 years old. She is, by any measure, a bank would understand, an extraordinarily wealthy and powerful woman. She is the founder and chief executive of Ellison Stewart Capital, an asset management firm that oversees a little over $4 billion. She built it from nothing, from a folding card table in a one-bedroom apartment. Over 30 years, one client at a time, on a reputation for being the most careful, most honest, most ruthlessly precise person anybody in the business had ever met. She is the kind of investor whose phone calls get returned within the hour by people far more famous than she is. She has testified before Congress on lending discrimination. She has a doctorate in economics. And she has framed in her office not her diploma and not her press clippings, but a single soft, worn manila folder. The corner's gone fuzzy from 50 years of handling, and inside it, that folded foreclosure. Notice from 1974, she took it out of her mother's things after the funeral. She has carried it, in one form or another, ever since. And here is the thing you need to understand about Vivian Ellison before we go any further. Because it is the engine of everything that happens next. She is calm, not cold. Calm. There is a difference. And the people who confuse the two always regret it. She does not raise her voice. She does not repeat herself. She has learned over 50 years that the loudest person in a room is almost never the most powerful one, and that the surest way to find out exactly what someone thinks of you is to let them believe you are no one. She has made a career, in part, out of being underestimated, and then out of the very quiet, very total moment when the underestimating stops. People who have worked with her describe the same thing. They describe a woman who will sit silent in a meeting for 40 minutes while everyone else performs their intelligence, and then say one sentence, exactly one, that reorganizes the entire problem and makes everything that came before it sound like noise. They describe a negotiator who never bluffs because she doesn't have to, because she does the work, because by the time she's in the room, she already knows more about the other side's position than the other side does. They describe a boss who has fired exactly 3 people in 30 years and helped 200 buy their first homes. There is a saying inside Ellison Stewart Capital, half a joke and half a warning, that the most dangerous thing in the building is Dr. Ellison being polite to you. Because Dr. Ellison is polite to everyone, right up until the moment she has decided something, and after that, she is simply, quietly, immovable, like weather, like the tide, like a fact. She came up in an industry that did everything it could to keep her out. That mistook her for the help in 100 lobbies. That assumed her assistant was the boss, and that she was there to take notes. And she did not get angry about any of it. Not on the outside, because she figured out young that anger was a currency they wanted her to spend, that a black woman who raised her voice in those rooms handed them the excuse they were waiting for. So she kept her voice low, and her numbers high, and she let her work be loud on her behalf. And it worked. It worked completely. $4 billion worth of completely This particular week, Ellison Stewart Capital is doing something significant. It is moving a very large block of money, $400 million of institutional assets belonging to a coalition of teachers' pension funds, and historically, Black college endowments that have trusted Vivian for 2 decades, into a new banking relationship. Whichever bank wins that relationship gets the deposits, the fees, the prestige, and a decade of business. 3 banks are competing for it. One of them is Cornerstone Federal Trust. Cornerstone is old. Old money. Old building. Old portraits of old men in the lobby. It is the kind of institution that still believes, somewhere in its marble bones, that the people who matter look a certain way and arrive a certain way, and that you can tell, just by looking, who belongs in the good chairs. Cornerstone's regional director is a man named Preston Vance. Preston Vance is 51. He has the kind of face that has never once been told no by a man it considered an equal. His grandfather sat on the bank's board. His office is on the 40th floor. Glass. On 3 sides. A view of the river. He has a reputation, inside the bank, for knowing how to read a client, which is a polite way of saying he has very strong opinions, formed in the first 4 seconds, about who is worth his time. He has been told that Ellison Stewart Capital is coming in this week to finalize the relationship. He has been told it is the biggest piece of business his branch will book this year. What he has not done, because it did not occur to him to do it, is look up a single photograph of who actually runs Ellison Stewart Capital. He always assumes, he pictured someone who looked like the money, looked to him. He pictured, frankly, a man. It would be easy, and it would be a lie, to make Preston Vance a cartoon. He is not a man who walks around using slurs. He would be genuinely offended if you called him a racist. He gives to charity. He has a Black colleague he plays golf with twice a year. He believes, sincerely, that he treats everyone the same. And that is precisely what makes him dangerous. And what makes him true to life? Because the men in 1974 who wrote Vivian's father's loan also did not think of themselves as villains. They thought of themselves as prudent. They thought they were managing risk. The bias in Preston Vance does not live in his words. It lives in the 4 seconds. It lives in the instant automatics. Invisible calculation. His mind runs every time a person walks toward him. The calculation that sorts the world into people who matter and people who don't, and that has been trained over a whole life of inherited advantage to put certain faces in the second pile before they've said a word. He does not know he is doing it. That is the entire problem. The cruelty that built that conference room and that lobby is not loud and proud. It is polite. It is efficient. It wears a good coat and gives to charity and would never, ever use the word. And it costs families their houses just the same. So, we already saw how the afternoon begins. We saw Brooke at the reception desk, and the brochure, and the good chairs, and the community credit union across the street. We saw Vivian go quiet and fold her hands over that worn manila folder and decide to sit down and wait. Now let me show you what she actually did while she waited, because Vivian Ellison has been in 1,000 rooms like that one, and she knows that a waiting room is not wasted time. A waiting room is data, and here is what the data showed her. Over the next 3 hours, at 2:15, a white man in an expensive overcoat walks up to the same reception desk. Brooke lights up. "Mr. Hargrove, let me get someone right down for you." He does not wait. He is escorted to the elevator within 90 seconds. He does not have a confirmation either. Nobody asks him for one. At 2:40, 2 more men arrive. Younger, in good suits. Laughing about something, Brooke offers them coffee. Coffee. Vivian, sitting 12 feet away, has not been offered water. At 2:55, a delivery driver comes in. A young black man in a uniform, carrying a stack of catering boxes for some meeting on an upper floor. And Vivian watches Brooke's whole posture change, watches her point him sharply toward a service entrance down the hall, watches her tone go flat and clipped in a way it did not go for Mr. Hargrove. And Vivian files it away because she is building a picture. And the picture is not about her at all. The picture is about a building and about the second automatic sorting that happens at the front door of that building, the one nobody on the upper floors ever sees because it happens before anyone gets upstairs. The delivery driver finds the service entrance. He's used to it. He doesn't even look surprised. And that, the not being surprised, is its own quiet indictment. And Vivian feels it land somewhere old in her chest. At 3:05, an older black woman comes in, maybe 70, in her church clothes, clearly nervous, clutching a savings passbook. The paper kind, the kind people of a certain generation still keep, and she goes to the desk and asks, softly, about a problem with her account. And Brooke, not cruelly, but not warmly either, tells her she'll have to take a number and wait. And the woman takes a number and sits down 2 seats from Vivian. And she holds her passbook in both hands. The way you hold something that is most of what you have. And Vivian looks at her. This woman, who could be her own mother, if her mother had lived. And something hardens in Vivian, quietly, permanently, because she realizes she is not the only person in this lobby being told, in 100 small ways, that she is the wrong kind of client. She is just the only one who happens to have $400 million and the power to do something about it. And she thinks, sitting there, that is exactly the problem. That justice in this country so often requires the victim to also happen to be a billionaire. That the woman with the passbook has the same right to be treated like a human being that I do. And she will not get it today. Because there is no managing director coming down to recognize her face. At 3:10, Vivian Rise walks back to the desk and asks, one more time, still perfectly calm, whether her meeting has been forgotten, the Ellison-Stewart relationship, Mr. Vance, and Brooke, who has now decided that this persistent woman in the gray coat is becoming a minor problem, tells her, again, that she really doesn't think she's in the right place, that this is a private institution, that they work with a very specific kind of client here. And then, lowering her voice, leaning in a tone that is almost kind, which is somehow worse, she tells her, one more time, that the community credit union across the street might be a better fit. For here, Vivian looks at her for a moment. Not angrily. She looks at her the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. reading something underneath the surface that the patient can't see. And then she says, "Thank you. I'll keep waiting." And she goes back and sits down, and she opens the soft manila folder on her lap, just for a moment, and she looks at the folded piece of paper inside it, the one from 1974. And then she closes it again. Nobody sees her do this. There's no camera on her. This is not a performance. It is a private moment between a woman and the worst day of her childhood, and what she takes from it. Sitting in that cold marble lobby, being told she'd be a better fit across the street, is not rage. It's resolve, because she has been across that street. She started across that street, and she knows exactly what it costs a person to be told. Again and again, in 100 polite ways, that they are not the right kind of client. She has spent 50 years building something so that no one could ever say it to her again. And here it is, being said to her again, by a young woman who wasn't even born when Vivian closed her first fund at 350. An actual emergency saves Cornerstone Federal Trust from itself, although they won't understand, for another hour, how close they came to, never knowing what they'd done. A senior managing director named Eleanor Shaw comes down to the lobby looking for a package. Eleanor is 61. She has been at the bank for 30 years. She is the only person in the building who has actually read the file on the Ellison-Stewart relationship, cover to cover, because Eleanor reads everything, and she has seen, on page 1, the name and the title of the person they are meeting, Dr. Vivian Ellison, founder and chief executive officer. Eleanor crosses the lobby toward the desk, and as she passes the waiting area, she glances at the woman in the gray coat with the soft folder, and something in her stomach drops, because Eleanor has been to 2 conferences where Dr. Vivian Ellison gave the keynote address, and Eleanor never forgets a face. She stops. She turns. She says, very carefully, "Dr. Ellison," and Vivian looks up, and for the first time all afternoon, somebody has said her name. She says, simply, yes. Eleanor Shaw goes pale. She looks at the clock on the lobby wall. It reads 3:52. The meeting was at 2. She looks at the empty chair beside Vivian, the chair where a glass of water should have been 3 hours ago. She looks back at the reception desk, at Brooke, who is watching this with a slowly dawning expression of pure dread. And Eleanor does the only thing a person of conscience can do, which is to stop pretending the template is reality. I want to stay with Eleanor Shaw for a second, because she matters more than she looks like she matters. And because in every story like this, there is someone like her, and what they do is the hinge the whole thing turns on. Eleanor is 61. She has spent 30 years inside this institution. She has seen things over those 30 years that she did not like, and most of them she let go. The way you let things go when you have a mortgage and a pension and a belief that you can do more good staying inside than walking out. She is not a hero. She would tell you that herself. She is a woman who read a file, who knew a name, and who, when the moment came, in a cold lobby at 3:52 in the afternoon, chose, in the space of a single breath, to do the right thing instead of the comfortable thing. That breath is everything, because the comfortable thing, the thing 9 out of 10 people do in that moment, is to quietly fix the immediate problem and bury the larger one. The comfortable thing is to rush Vivian upstairs, apologize, salvage the meeting, save the $400 million, and never, ever mention the 3 hours. Never make it a thing. Never force the building to look at itself. Smooth it over. Move the money. Protect the relationship. That is what an institution trains you to do. And Eleanor had 30 years of that training, and she didn't do it. She looked at Dr. Vivian Ellison, sitting in a chair where a glass of water should have been, and she understood, all at once, that the water and the 3 hours and the better fit across the street were not a customer service problem to be smoothed over. They were a symptom, and Eleanor Shaw decided, in that breath, that she was done smoothing over symptoms. So she did the uncomfortable thing. She said the true thing out loud. Dr. Ellison, Eleanor says, and her voice is shaking just slightly. I am so deeply sorry. How long have you been waiting? Since 1:45. Vivian says. Eleanor closes her eyes for a second. Please, she says. Please come with me. And here is the part you've been waiting for. Here is where the afternoon turns. They go up to the 40th floor. Glass on 3 sides. The river below. Preston Vance is in the large conference room, and he has assembled a team because he believes the Ellison Stewart people are about to arrive. Fashionably late. The way important people are late. And he has been killing time telling his juniors about a sailing trip. The door opens. Eleanor Shaw walks in first, and behind her comes a woman in a gray coat, holding a soft manila folder, and Preston Vance glances at her, and then glances away, because she does not register. To him, as a person he needs to look at, he actually says, to Eleanor, not unkindly, gesturing at Vivian without making eye contact, Eleanor, we're about to start a major client meeting. Can this wait? Whoever she's here for, someone else can handle it. Preston, Eleanor says quietly, this is Dr. Vivian Ellison. The room does not understand. For 1 full second. And then it does. You can watch it move across Preston Vance's face, like weather. The name, the title, the $400 million. The gray coat, he didn't look twice at. The 3 hours. The realization, arriving all at once and far too late, that the most important client his branch will book this year, the woman he and his entire floor have been waiting to impress, has been sitting in his lobby since before lunch, being treated like someone who wandered in off the street to ask about a savings account, and that he, Preston Vance, just told a senior managing director to make her wait because he didn't think she was worth interrupting a story about sailing. Dr. Ellison, he says, and his voice has changed completely. All the easy authority gone out of it, replaced by something high and fast. Of course. Please sit. I had no idea. There must have been a terrible mix-up downstairs. And Vivian Ellison does the thing she has been doing all afternoon. She is calm. She does not raise her voice. She walks to the head of the long table, the seat Preston Vance was sitting in, and she stands behind it. And she sets her soft folder down on the polished wood, and she looks around the room at all of them. Slowly, one face at a time. And then she speaks. For the first time, at any volume, and her voice is steady and quiet, and it fills the entire room because everyone in it has stopped breathing. "Sit down, Mr. Vance," she says. He sits. "I'd like to tell you about my afternoon." Vivian says, "And then I'm going to tell you about the last 50 years. Because the two are connected, and I think it's important that everyone in this room understands the connection. Before we discuss whether Ellison Stewart Capital is going to place $400 million with this institution, nobody moves. Eleanor Shaw stands by the door with her hand over her mouth. I arrived at 1:45. Vivian says, "I gave my name to the young woman at your reception desk. She told me she doesn't hand out charity accounts to older black women who wander in off the street. She threw a brochure across her desk at me. She told me there's a credit union across the street that would be a better fit for my kind. She told me to stop blocking the good chairs. She did not write down my name. She did not call your office. She decided, the moment she looked at me, that I was not the kind of person who has a 2 o'clock with the regional director." Preston Vance's face is gray. At 2:15, Vivian continues. "A Mr. Hargrove arrived. White man. Nice coat. No confirmation. He was upstairs in 90 seconds. At 3:40, 2 more gentlemen arrived and were offered coffee. I was not offered water. At 3:10, I went back to the desk to ask, again, whether my meeting had been forgotten, and your receptionist told me, one more time, that this is a private institution, that you work with a very specific kind of client here, and that the community credit union across the street might be a better fit for me." The silence in the room is total. I want you to understand. Vivian says that I am not telling you this because my feelings are hurt. I am 58 years old. I have testified before the United States Congress. My feelings recovered from this kind of thing a long time ago. I am telling you this because of what it reveals. Because the way an institution treats a woman, it believes no one is the truest possible measure of that institution's character. You did not know who I was. And so, this afternoon, you showed me exactly who you are. She opens the soft manila folder. She does not take anything out of it yet. She just opens it and rests her hand on the page inside and looks down at it for a moment and then back up at the room. "Now I'm going to tell you about 50 years ago," she says, and she tells them about the row house in Cleveland, the cold morning, the men carrying the kitchen table down the steps, her little brother's hand in hers, her mother in the doorway, holding herself up. She tells them about the loan her father was given, the one with the balloon clause on page 9, the doubled rate, the stacked fees. The loan a bank writes for a family it has already decided to foreclose on. She tells them that the white family 3 doors down got a clean refinancing the year before, and her father, who had never missed a payment he could make, got a trap, dressed up as a lifeline. She tells them about the foreclosure. Notice the marshal handed her mother, and how her mother folded it in half and slipped it into her apron pocket, like a receipt, because there were 2 children on the sidewalk who still needed breakfast, and a mother does not get to fall down. And then she takes the folded piece of paper out of the folder, the one from 1974, soft at the creases, from 50 years of being carried, and she sets it on the polished conference table in front of Preston Vance. And she says, "This is that notice. I have carried it for 50 years. I built a $4 billion firm carrying it. And I carry it because of a very simple idea. Mr. Vance, An idea I have organized my entire life around. The idea is this. The reason my family lost that house was not bad luck. It was a decision made by men in a building like this one, who looked at my father and decided what kind of client he was before he opened his mouth. And I promised myself, standing on that curb, when I was 9 years old, that one day I would have enough power that no one could ever do to anyone what they did to us. In a room where I was sitting, and then I would use that power. She lets that sit. So, she says, and her voice is almost gentle now, which is the most dangerous it has been all afternoon. Let's discuss the $400 million. Now, here is where a lesser story would have her simply storm out, pull the money, and let the bank burn. And she does pull the money, but watch what she actually does. Because the difference is the entire point, and it is the difference between revenge and justice. Vivian sits down. Finally, at the head of the table, she folds her hands on the soft folder, and she says, I am not going to place Ellison Stewart's assets with Cornerstone Federal Trust. I think that's obvious to everyone in this room, and I'll have my office send the formal notice within the hour. The relationship is over. But I want to be very clear about why, because the reason matters more than the decision. She looks at Preston Vance. It is not because your receptionist was rude to me. People are rude. That is survivable. I am not ending a $400 million relationship over hurt feelings in a lobby. I am ending it because of what the lobby told me about the building. Because if this is how Cornerstone treats a person it believes has no money and no power, then I have to ask myself a question. And the question is this: what does Cornerstone do to people who actually have no money and no power, when there is no managing director who happens to recognize their face, and no $400 million sitting in the room to make everyone suddenly polite? She turns to Eleanor Shaw, who is still standing by the door. Miss Shaw, you read the file. You knew my name. You're the reason I'm sitting up here instead of still in that lobby? So I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I would like a direct answer. Does Cornerstone Federal Trust have a community and small business lending division? Eleanor swallows. Yes, she says. On the lower floors, consumer and small business lending. And who runs the credit modeling for that division? Who decides the terms? Who decides who gets the clean loan? And who gets the loan with the clause? On page 9, the room is very quiet, and Preston Vance, who has been silent and gray for 10 minutes, says, in a small voice, that would ultimately roll up to me. The regional division includes consumer lending. Yes. Vivian says, I know it does. I looked it up while I was waiting in your lobby for 3 hours. I had the time, and for the first time all afternoon, there is the faintest, coldest edge of something like a smile. Mr. Vance, I want you to understand something. The $400 million walking out of this building today is not the thing you should be worried about. You'll survive losing one relationship. What you should be worried about is what I am going to do next. And I am telling you about it in advance, in front of witnesses, because I want you to have the chance to do the right thing. Before I make you, she stands again. She picks up the folded notice, and she returns it, gently, to the soft manila folder. And she closes the folder, and she tucks it under her arm. Here is what is going to happen, she says, and this is the reveal under the reveal. The first reveal was who she is. The second reveal, the one that actually matters, is what she came to do. I sit on the board of 3 organizations that you have never heard of. Vivian says, because they do unglamorous work. One of them is a fair lending advocacy fund that has, for the last several years, been quietly compiling data on lending outcomes at legacy banks, statistical analysis, low and level data, the kind of thing that does not lie, the way a lobby lies, the way a brochure lies, approval rates by neighborhood, interest rate spreads on identical credit profiles. The mathematics of who an institution decides is a very specific kind of client. She looks around the room. I did not come here today, only to place money. I came here because Cornerstone has been on our list for a while, and I wanted to see the institution with my own eyes before I made a recommendation. And you, this afternoon, made my recommendation for me. Within the week, our fund is going to formally request, and where necessary subpoena, through the appropriate regulators, Cornerstone's consumer lending data for the last 7 years. Approval rates, rate spreads, the terms of every small loan written on those lower floors. And we are going to run the numbers. And if the numbers show what I suspect they show, what they almost always show, that the family across the street from this building is getting my father's loan in this very year, the loan with the clause on page 9, while the family Mr. Hargrove belongs to gets the clean one, then this stops being about my afternoon. It becomes a federal matter, and the people who run this institution will answer for it. Not to me, but to a regulator with the power to make them stop. She walks toward the door, and then she stops, and she turns around, and she says the thing that the whole story has been building toward, the thing that is the difference between this and a revenge story. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Vance, about what I want, because I think you've spent this whole conversation waiting for me to want revenge, and I can see you bracing for it. And I want to release you from that, because it's beneath both of us. I don't want you ruined. I want you changed. I want this building changed. I want a family on the south side of this city, 50 years from now, to walk into a bank and get the loan they've earned, on the terms they've earned, regardless of what they're wearing, or what their name is, or what the person behind the desk decides about them in the first 4 seconds. That is the only thing I have ever wanted, and it is the only reason I built any of this. The money was never the point. The money was the tool, and today, the tool gets used. She puts her hand on the door. Miss Shaw, she says, without turning around. You did the right thing today. Late, but you did it. So I'm going to leave you with the one piece of advice I'd give my younger self. When the data comes, and it will come, don't defend the building. Fix it. The people who fix it will be remembered. The people who defend it will not. And then, to the room. Good afternoon. And she walks out. Nobody in that conference room says a word for a long time. Preston Vance sits very still, looking at the place on the polished table where, for a few minutes, a folded 50-year-old foreclosure notice had been lying in his bank, accusing his entire profession, and he understands, slowly, the way the temperature drops before a storm, that his afternoon, and quite possibly his career, has just changed completely. And the reason it changed is that he looked at a woman in a gray coat and decided she was no one. He decided it in 4 seconds. It was the most expensive 4 seconds of his life. Now, let me take you across the street. Because while all of this was happening on the 40th floor, across the street, in the community credit union that Brooke told Vivian would be a better fit for her, a different story was unfolding. And it's the story that makes all of this matter. Because these kinds of stories are never only about the powerful person and the powerful insult. They're about the people who never get a managing director coming down to recognize their face. They're about the family, with no $400 million in the room, to make everyone suddenly polite. In that credit union, that same afternoon, a woman named Denise Carter, 34, a home health aide, was sitting across a desk from a loan officer, being told, gently and apologetically, that she'd been turned down again, not by the credit union. The credit union was trying to help her. She'd been turned down by Cornerstone, where she'd applied first, for a small loan to fix the roof on the house she'd inherited from her grandmother, the house she was raising her 2 kids in. And Cornerstone had offered her a loan, technically, but the loan they offered her had a rate nearly double what her credit score should have qualified for, and fees that made no sense, and a structure that the loan officer at the credit union, looking at the paperwork, frowned at, and said, "Miss Carter, I've got to be honest with you. This is not a good loan. This is the kind of loan a bank writes when they're hoping you'll fall behind. Where did you say you got this?" And Denise said, "The big bank? Across the street, Cornerstone." And the loan officer shook her head slowly, because she'd seen that exact paper, that exact structure, come across her desk before. Always from the same place. Always written for the same kind of family. Let me tell you about Denise Carter. Because she is not a statistic. And the whole point of this story is that she is not a statistic. Even though a bank's model had reduced her to 1, she is 34. She gets up at 5 in the morning and drives to 3 different houses to take care of 3 different elderly people who cannot take care of themselves, who depend on her, who light up when she walks in the door. Because Denise is the kind of person who remembers that Mr. Abernathy likes his coffee with exactly 1 sugar, and that Mrs. Reyes is afraid in the dark and needs the hall light left on. She has a credit score in the 700s, which she built carefully, on purpose, because her own grandmother taught her the same lesson. Vivian's father tried to teach his children that you carry yourself a certain way, that you pay what you owe, that you keep your word, and that if you do all that, the world is supposed to be fair to you. She has 2 kids, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7, and she is raising them in the house her grandmother left her, a small house with a leaking roof. And all she wanted, the entire sum of her ambition that week, was to fix the roof before winter, so the water would stop coming through the ceiling over her daughter's bed. That's it. That's the whole dream. A dry roof over a 7-year-old's bed. And she did everything right. She went to the big, respectable, marble-lobbied bank across the street. The one that looked safe, the one her grandmother would have called a real bank. And the real bank looked at a black home health aide from the South Side with a 700 credit score. And its model, the model trained on 50 years of decisions made by men like the ones who took Vivian's house, decided what kind of client she was. Before she finished her sentence, and it offered her a loan, built to fail, not a refusal, a trap. The modern version of the clause on page 9, and the only reason Denise didn't sign it, the only reason she isn't, right now, slowly drowning under a loan designed to take her grandmother's house is that she happened to walk across the street to the little credit union for a second opinion, and a loan officer there happened to be honest enough to tell her the truth. Pure luck. The thinnest possible margin of luck. And that is the thing that should make you furious. Quietly. The way it made Vivian furious, that whether or not Denise Carter keeps her grandmother's house came down to whether she happened to get a second opinion, the system did not protect her. A coincidence protected her. Everyone who doesn't get the coincidence, and most people don't, signs the paper and loses the house, and never knows that the house was taken from them on purpose by a machine in 4 seconds. Before they open their mouth, Denise Carter does not know Vivian Ellison. They have never met. They will. Eventually. But not today. Today they are 2 black women on the same block, 50 years, and $4 billion apart, who have been handed the exact same loan, the loan with the clause on page 9, by the exact same kind of institution, separated by half a century, in which the institution learned to call it risk-based pricing, instead of what Vivian's father's generation would have called it, which is the truth. That is the wound. The story is actually about not the lobby. The lobby is just where you can see it. Now, let's move forward in time. Because justice in a story like this is not a single dramatic afternoon. It's slow. It's structural. It's the part nobody films. But it's the part that lasts. 3 days after the meeting, Vivian's Fair Lending Fund formally requested Cornerstone's consumer lending data, Preston Vance, to his enormous credit, and to the surprise of nearly everyone, did not fight it. He had spent 3 days thinking about a folded piece of paper from 1974 and about a question he could not get out of his head. What does this bank do to people who have no $400 million in the room? And somewhere in those 3 days, Preston Vance stopped being a man defending a building and started being a man who needed to know the answer. He instructed the lending division to cooperate fully. Eleanor Shaw, who took Vivian's advice almost word for word, led the internal review herself. And the data showed exactly what Vivian suspected it would show, because it almost always does. On identical credit profiles, applicants from majority black neighborhoods were offered interest rates significantly higher than applicants from majority white neighborhoods. They were steered, far more often, into loan structures with balloon clauses and stacked fees. The modern descendants of the loan that took Vivian's family's house, the approval rates told their own story. The rate spreads told a worse one. It was not a few bad loan officers. It was the model itself. The algorithm Cornerstone, used to price risk, had learned, from decades of biased human decisions fed into it as training data, to do quietly and at scale exactly what the men in 1974 did by hand. To look at a family and decide, before anyone opened their mouth, what kind of client they were. The bank had not gotten less discriminatory over 50 years. It had gotten more efficient at it. It had automated Vivian's father's loan. When the analysis was complete, it went, as Vivian had promised, to the regulators. Not as an act of revenge. Vivian made that distinction in every conversation, but as a matter of record, because the law that was supposed to protect Denise Carter only works if someone makes it work. A federal fair lending investigation opened, and Cornerstone Federal Trust, faced with the mathematics of its own conduct, laid out in numbers that do not lie the way a lobby lies, made a choice. It could fight, spend years and a fortune defending the indefensible, and lose anyway. Or it could do the thing almost no institution does, which is to look at the truth and decide to become something better. It chose, in the end, to change. And the person who drove that choice, from the inside, was a man named Preston Vance. Here is the part that surprises people, and it's the part Vivian cared about most. Preston Vance did not get fired. He very nearly did. The board wanted a head on a spike, and a head on a spike is easy and satisfying and changes nothing. But Vivian, asked privately for her view by a regulator she'd known for years, said something that the regulator never forgot. She said, "Firing him is the cheap version of justice. It lets the building tell itself. The problem was one man, and then the building goes right on doing what it did. I don't want his head. I want him to spend the rest of his career fixing the exact thing he spent the first half of it benefiting from. That's harder than firing him, and it's worth more." So Preston Vance kept his job on the condition that he personally lead the bank's lending reform. And he did, because a man who has truly understood what he did, who has held the weight of a folded foreclosure notice in his mind for long enough, is more useful repairing the wall than buried under it. Over the following year, Cornerstone rebuilt its consumer lending model from the ground up, with outside auditors, with the Fair Lending Fund's data scientists in the room, with the bias scrubbed out of the training data, and the page 9 clauses outlawed by policy. They established an independent review board with the power to overturn any loan decision that showed a discriminatory pattern. They retrained every loan officer, and, at Eleanor Shaw's insistence, they did one more thing. They went back through 7 years of loans and identified every family who had been steered into a predatory structure they should never have been offered. And they refinanced those loans, retroactively, at the terms those families had actually qualified for in the first place. It cost the bank a great deal of money. It was, in the most literal sense, the bank paying back a debt it owed. It is worth slowing down on what that reform actually meant, because systemic change is the kind of phrase that slides right past a person, and the whole point of a story like this is that it should not slide past. Tearing the bias out of that lending model was not a press release. It was a year of brutal, unglamorous, line-by-line work. It meant sitting data scientists down with 20 years of loan records and forcing the model to confront the fact that it had learned to use a borrower's zip code as a stand-in for race. The way a clever cheater learns to get the answer without showing the forbidden work. It meant discovering that the algorithm had taught itself a dozen of these tricks. Proxies for race. Hidden inside variables that looked, on the surface, perfectly innocent. The name of the high school a person attended, the distance from their home to the nearest branch, the type of phone they applied from. Every one of those was a back door the machine had found to do quietly what the law forbade it to do openly. And one by one, the team found those back doors and closed them, and tested the model again, and found new ones, and closed those too, for a year, because bias is not a single wall you knock down. It is water. It finds every crack, and the only way to keep it out is to keep checking, forever, which is exactly why Cornerstone agreed to the permanent independent review board, the one with the power to overturn any pattern that started to drift. That board did not exist to punish the bank once. It existed to make sure the bank could never again drift back into its old habits without someone seeing it happen. That is what systemic change actually is. It is not a grand gesture. It is the boring, permanent, institutionalized refusal to let the water back in. And here is the thing that Vivian understood, that almost nobody understands, which is why she structured the whole intervention the way she did. A single firing changes nothing, because the bias was never in one person. It was in the building, in the model, in the 4 seconds. A lawsuit that ends in a settlement changes very little, because a settlement is just a number the bank pays to make the problem go away, without ever having to look at it. And a bank that can afford the settlement will simply price it in as a cost of doing business and keep doing business exactly as before. What changes things? The only thing that changes things is forcing the institution to rebuild the actual machinery, and then leaving behind a permanent watcher to make sure it stays rebuilt. Vivian did not want a check. Cornerstone offered her a check. Early on, through lawyers, a quiet settlement to make the Fair Lending Fund's inquiry disappear. A very large check, and she turned it down without a second's hesitation, because a check would have let the building off the hook, and the building was the whole point. She wanted the machinery rebuilt. She wanted the watcher installed. She wanted Denise Carter's daughter, and 10,000 daughters like her, to sleep dry. Not because they got lucky with a second opinion, but because the bank across the street was no longer in the business of building loans designed to fail. That is a harder thing to win than a check. It takes longer, and it makes fewer headlines, but it is the only kind of victory that is still a victory 50 years later. When everyone in this story is gone, and a family on the South Side walks into a bank and gets the loan they earned, and never even knows there was once a fight about whether they'd be allowed to. One of the families on that list was Denise Carter. She got a letter. She almost didn't open it. She'd learned, like Vivian's mother, to be afraid of envelopes from banks. But she opened it, and she read it twice, and then a third time, and then she sat down at her kitchen table, because her legs had gone strange under her. The letter said that her loan had been reviewed, that she had been offered terms she should never have been offered, and that Cornerstone was correcting it, refinancing her roof loan at less than half the rate, removing the fees, restructuring it into something a person could actually pay. The roof on her grandmother's house, the house she was raising her kids in, was going to get fixed, and she was not going to lose the house doing it. She never knew, reading that letter, that any of it traced back to a woman in a gray coat who'd been told on the very same block, the very same week, that she'd be a better fit across the street. She never knew there'd been a folded piece of paper from 1974 sitting on a conference table on the 40th floor. She just knew that, for once, somehow, the system had gotten it right. And that's all most people ever need. Not a parody, not a medal, just once. The rules being the same for them as for everybody. The roof got fixed that fall. A crew came and tore off the old shingles and laid down new ones. And the water stopped coming through the ceiling over the 7-year-old's bed. And Denise stood in the yard one evening and looked up at her grandmother's house with its good new roof, and she cried, not from sadness, from the specific exhausted relief of a person who has been bracing for a disaster that finally, against all her experience, did not come. Her son asked her why she was crying, and she said, "Because we get to keep our house, baby." And he said, "Were we going to lose it?" And she said, "Almost, but not anymore." And she pulled him in and held him and did not explain the rest. Because how do you explain to a 10-year-old that the house was nearly taken from him by a machine that decided, before his mother finished a sentence, what kind of people they were? You don't. You just fix the roof, and you hold your boy in the yard, and you let him grow up in a world that is, in this one small way, on this one small block, a little more fair than the one you grew up in. There is a coda to Denise's story, and it's the only time the two halves of this story ever touch. About 18 months after that afternoon, the Fair Lending Fund held a small event, nothing fancy, to mark the completion of the cornerstone reforms, and they invited a handful of the families whose loans had been corrected to speak, if they wanted to, about what it had meant. Denise almost didn't go. She's not one for events. But she went, and she stood up in a community room with bad lighting and folding chairs. And she told her story, plainly, the roof, and the second opinion, and the letter, and she said, at the end, I don't know who did this. I don't know whose idea it was to go back and look at people like me. But I want them to know we're real. We're not just numbers on whatever report made them do this. My daughter sleeps dry now. That's real. And Vivian Ellison was in the back of that room. Because Vivian goes to these things, quietly, in the back, and she listened to Denise Carter say, my daughter sleeps dry now. And she did not stand up and announce herself, because that has never once been the point. Because justice that needs an audience was never the real thing. She just sat in the back, in a plain coat, the way she'd sat in that lobby, and she let the folder on her lap stay closed. And she thought about a leaking roof over a 7-year-old's bed, and about the water that had come through the ceiling of a row house in Cleveland 50 years ago, after the gas got shut off. And she understood that the circle had closed, quietly, the way the most important things close, with no one watching, in a room with bad lighting and folding chairs. And then she got up and left, before anyone could ask her name, because she'd gotten what she came for. She always does. Now let's go back to Vivian, because there's one more thing, and it's the quietest thing in the whole story, and it's the part I keep thinking about. About a year after that afternoon at Cornerstone, Vivian Ellison hired a new junior analyst at Ellison Stewart Capital, a young woman, 23, brilliant, fresh out of school, the first person in her family to go to college, a little nervous, a little too eager, wearing a suit she clearly couldn't quite afford, and had bought specifically for the job. Her name was Aliyah, and on Aliyah's first day, Vivian called her into her office, the office where the soft manila folder sits, framed on the wall, and Aliyah looked at it. This old, fuzzy-cornered folder, under glass, surrounded by all the awards and the diplomas, it had elbowed aside, and she was too polite to ask. But Vivian saw her looking. You're wondering why a piece of old paper is on my wall, where the trophies should be, Vivian said, a little, Mom, Aliyah admitted. So, Vivian told her. The row house, the cold morning, the men carrying the table down the steps, the loan with the clause on page 9. the mother in the doorway, holding herself up, folding the worst day of her life into a neat little square, and slipping it into her apron pocket, because two children on a sidewalk still needed breakfast. And Aaliyah listened. This 23-year-old, in a suit she couldn't afford, and her eyes filled up because some part of her knew this story, had lived a version of this story, the way so many families have. And Vivian said, "I'm going to tell you the same thing I told a man in a glass office on the 40th floor of a bank a year ago. And it's the only thing I really know for certain. After 50 years in this business, the money is never the point. The money is the tool. People are going to spend your whole career trying to get you to forget that, trying to make the money the point. Because money that's only about itself is easy to take from people and easy to use against them. But you remember what it's for. You remember the family on the curb. You build everything you build so that one day you'll be in a room where it matters. And on that day, you use what you've built. Most people, when they finally get power, spend it buying a bigger version of the life that the powerful told them to want. Don't spend it on the curb. Spend it on the family that doesn't know your name and never will. That's the whole job. Everything else is just learning how to count." Aaliyah nodded and wiped her eyes. And Vivian, who is not a sentimental woman, who does not raise her voice and does not repeat herself, turned back to her work, because there was a great deal of it to do, and the day was not getting any longer. And here's why I even tell you this story. Think about it. A woman walked into a bank in a plain gray coat, and they decided, in 4 seconds, that she was no one. They made her wait 3 hours. They threw a brochure at her. They told her she'd be a better fit across the street. And the reason that single afternoon ended with a federal investigation, a bank rebuilt, and a home health aide named Denise Carter keeping the house she was raising her kids in, is that 50 years earlier, a 9-year-old girl stood on a curb and watched her mother fold up the worst day of their lives into a neat little square, and decided, right then, that she would spend her entire life making sure the rules got to be the same for everybody. Not louder. Not angrier. Just the same. That's not a movie. That's the kind of thing that's actually happening. Right now. In a marble lobby somewhere, where someone in a plain coat is being told they're a better fit across the street. And nobody's asking the only question that matters, which is, who is she? Or who is he? Or who are they? Really? Underneath what you decided about them in the first 4 seconds. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever walked into a room and been measured instantly by everything except who you actually are? What did you do? Did you raise your voice, or did you go quiet? Like Vivian, and let them find out the hard way. And do you think she was right? To want him changed instead of ruined? Or should the people who run a building like that face something harder than a chance to fix it? Tell me below. I read them, and if any part of this landed on you, if you've ever folded up a bad day and put it in your pocket and kept walking because somebody was counting on you, then do me a favor. Like this video. Share it with one person who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because these are the stories I'm going to keep telling. The quiet ones, the ones nobody films, the ones that turn out to matter most.